The desert does not explain itself. It only keeps what time has not yet managed to erase. At dawn, when the light first touches the limestone plateau, the pyramids of Giza seem almost too permanent to belong to human history. Their edges rise from the pale sand like a promise that power can become stone, that a king can command a landscape, that a civilization can build itself into eternity and win. Yet the mystery begins precisely there, in that illusion of permanence. For the greatest monuments of Egypt's pyramid age were not built at the end of a flourishing world. They were built before a long unravelling. They stand not only as symbols of achievement, but as shadows cast backward from a society that, within a few generations, would no longer be able to build like this, govern like this, or imagine kingship in quite the same way again. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of Egypt's Old Kingdom is not simply the story of pyramids. It is the story of how one of the most powerful states of the ancient world reached a height so dazzling that later ages remembered it as almost superhuman, and then slowly lost the conditions that made that height possible. The stones remain, but the system that raised them did not. The kings still stare out from their names in offering chambers and temple fragments. But the world that fed their labour crews, moved their granite, counted their grain, and kept their divine authority alive eventually begins to bend beneath pressures no one monument could hold back. To stand near the pyramids today is to see the answer and the question at once. The answer is visible in millions of blocks of limestone, in causeways and valley temples, in burial chambers sealed deep inside engineered mountains, in the extraordinary confidence of a court that believed the dead king must ascend to the sky and continue to sustain the order of the living world. But the question is quieter. It lies in what comes after. Why does the pyramid age? After centuries of experimentation and grandeur begin to fade? Why do royal tombs shrink? Why does the central state seem to loosen its grip? Why do provincial officials become more visible, more independent, more rooted in their own regions? Why does Egypt, after the long arc of the Old Kingdom, enter a period of divided authority that later historians call the First Intermediate Period? No single explanation fully accounts for this. That is what makes the end of the Pyramid Age so compelling. It is tempting to look for one catastrophe, one failed flood, one weak king, one famine, one rebellion, one final blow. Ancient history often invites such stories because ruins seem dramatic and endings seem cleaner from far away. But the evidence remains incomplete, and what survives in the record suggests something more complex. The Old Kingdom did not simply vanish in a single night of chaos. It appears to have weakened through a convergence of stresses: environmental uncertainty, changing Nile floods, administrative strain, increasing provincial power, the cost of royal mortuary cults, succession problems, and perhaps a slow loss of ideological certainty around kingship itself. The collapse, if that is even the right word, was not just a fall, it was a transformation. For centuries before that transformation, Egypt had seemed almost uniquely stable. The Nile gave the country its rhythm. Each year, floodwaters came from far to the south, rising with the seasonal rains in the Ethiopian highlands and the wider Nile basin spreading across the valley, leaving behind dark silt and turning narrow strips of desert-framed land into some of the most productive fields in the ancient world. The river did not make Egypt simple, but it made Egypt possible. It carried grain, stone, people, orders, taxes, and symbols of royal authority. It tied distant towns to a central court. It allowed a king in Memphis to imagine that his command could flow north and south like the river itself. The Old Kingdom, beginning around the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, grows from this riverine world into something unprecedented. It organizes labor on a scale that still feels astonishing. It draws food from villages, stone from quarries, timber from distant trade networks, copper from desert routes, and skilled officials from an increasingly literate bureaucracy. It builds not merely tombs but entire sacred landscapes. Pyramid complexes include temples, offering places, causeways, boat pits, storehouses, priestly institutions, and estates assigned to sustain rituals long after the king's death. A pyramid is therefore never only a pile of stone. It is the visible peak of an administrative mountain. That mountain is easy to underestimate because the pyramid itself dominates the imagination. Yet behind every smooth casing block once gleaming in the Egyptian sun, there are scribes, overseers, bakers, brewers, potters, rope makers, boatmen, quarrymen, physicians, herders, farmers, and seasonal labor crews. There are cattle counts, grain accounts, ration lists, work gangs with names, tools that must be repaired, copper chisels that must be sharpened, and enormous amounts of bread and beer that must arrive on time. The state is not a vague abstraction. It is a daily machine of measurement and movement. Its greatness depends not only on belief, but on logistics. A lesser-known detail hides in the archaeology of the Pyramid Age. The most revealing traces are often not the grandest. A broken jar, a seal impression, a scribal correction, a worker settlement, a discarded tool, or the pattern of animal bones near a provisioning area can say as much about power as a royal inscription. The pyramids tell us what kings wanted eternity to remember. The debris around them tells us how human beings actually made that eternity possible. What survives in the record suggests a society that is not built by slaves in the old popular fantasy, but by an organized state capable of mobilizing and feeding large labor forces, likely including rotating teams of workers drawn from across the country, alongside permanent specialists and administrators. The popular image of endless misery under the lash belongs more to later imagination than to careful archaeology, though the burden on households and communities could still have been heavy. At the center of this world stands the king. He is not merely a ruler in the modern sense, he is the earthly holder of cosmic order, the one whose body, name, and ritual life connect Egypt to the stability of the universe. The Egyptian concept of order, often expressed through the idea of Ma'at, is not abstract philosophy alone. It is harvest, justice, hierarchy, correct ritual, predictable seasons, and the defeat of chaos at the edges of the known world. When the king builds, he does not only display wealth, he performs order in stone. When he dies, the pyramid ensures his continued transformation and power. The mortuary cult keeps offerings moving, priests employed, estates active, names spoken, and royal legitimacy renewed. But the very success of this system creates obligations that stretch across generations. Every king who builds a pyramid also creates a long afterlife of economic demand. Temples must be staffed, offerings must be supplied, lands may be assigned to support rituals. Priests and administrators become attached to institutions that outlive the ruler who founded them. In the early phases of the Old Kingdom, such commitments may enhance royal power, binding land, labor, and belief to the palace. Over time, however, scholars still debate whether these accumulating obligations helped drain or redistribute resources away from the living court. The dead kings do not disappear. In a sense, they remain on the budget. This is one of the quiet tensions beneath the Pyramid Age. The monuments proclaim permanence, but the state that maintains them is always changing. Power depends on balance between court and province, king and official, temple and treasury, flood and field, ideology and practical food supply. When the balance holds, the result is magnificent. When the balance falters, the same system that once projected invincibility may become rigid, expensive, and vulnerable. The landscape itself carries a warning. Egypt's fertile valley is narrow. Beyond it lies desert. The contrast is beautiful, but it is also severe. A few meters of elevation can separate life from barrenness. A strong Nile flood can nourish fields and fill granaries. A weak one can reduce harvests, strain storage, and expose the fragility behind royal confidence. The Egyptians understood the river as a source of abundance, but they also knew that abundance was never fully under human control. Even in a highly organized kingdom, no decree from Memphis could command the rains in distant highlands. No pyramid could force the flood to rise. Near the end of the Old Kingdom, the evidence for climate stress and lower Nile floods becomes one of the most important and most debated pieces of the puzzle. Some lines of research suggest that the wider region experienced arid conditions around the time often associated with the 4.2 kilo-year event, a period of climatic disturbance discussed across parts of the ancient world. In Egypt, reduced inundations could have had serious consequences, yet the evidence must be handled carefully. The 4.2 kilo-year event is not a simple global switch that turns prosperity into collapse everywhere at once. Recent scholarship has warned against treating it as a single uniform catastrophe. In Egypt, it is better understood as a possible pressure acting on an already complex system, not as a magic key that unlocks the entire mystery. That distinction matters because the end of the Pyramid Age is not only written in mud, drought, and river levels. It is also written in titles carved inside provincial tombs, in changes in burial customs, in the growing prominence of local elites, in the shrinking scale of royal monuments, and in the uneasy silence that falls over parts of the written record. The old centre at Memphis does not simply explode. Its authority appears to thin, and as it thins, other places become louder. Local governors, once instruments of royal administration, begin to look more like regional powers with their own identities, their own monuments, their own claims to memory. The pyramids, then, are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of the mystery. They show Egypt at a moment when the state can concentrate labour, faith, resources, and imagination into forms that still dominate the horizon 4,500 years later. But they also invite a harder question. What kind of society must exist to build such things, and what happens when the conditions sustaining that society begin to change? The answer lies not in one broken stone, but in a slow convergence of signs: the river's uncertainty, the weight of administration, the ambitions of the provinces, the long reigns and fragile successions of kings, the economic afterlife of royal cults, and the human reality of farmers and workers whose lives connect the palace to the field. At sunrise, the pyramids can seem eternal. By noon, they reveal their weathered surfaces, their missing casing stones, their scarred passages, their stripped temples, their broken causeways. They have survived, but not unchanged. The same is true of Egypt itself. The Old Kingdom does not vanish from human memory. It becomes a golden age, a model, a warning, and a dream that later rulers try to recover. But the first Great Pyramid Age ends because even the strongest ancient states are not made of stone alone. They are made of water, grain, belief, paperwork, loyalty, timing, and trust, and all of those things can shift. To understand why the Pyramid Age ends, the world that creates it has to be seen not as a silent desert kingdom, but as a living, crowded, carefully measured society stretched along the river. The pyramids rise from stone, but the Old Kingdom rises first from mud. Every year, the Nile lays down the dark soil that gives Egypt its ancient name, the Black Land, a narrow ribbon of fertility pressed between cliffs, desert, and sky. From above, the country looks impossibly fragile, almost like a green thread. Yet along that thread, a state grows powerful enough to command quarries, feed workforces, regulate fields, move stone across water, and turn the death of a king into one of the greatest building projects in human history. The Old Kingdom is often remembered through its kings, and that is understandable, because Egyptian royal ideology wants the king to fill the horizon. His name appears in cartouches, his pyramid dominates the western desert, his officials serve in his house, his afterlife shapes the ritual calendar. But daily Egypt is not lived only in palaces and temples. It is lived in villages, fields, storehouses, workshops, river ports, cattle pens, scribal offices, and provincial estates where the king is both distant and everywhere at once. A farmer may never stand before the ruler in Memphis, but the royal state touches his harvest. A potter may never see the burial chamber of a pyramid, but the vessels leaving his hands may serve a temple, a work gang, a household, or an offering system connected to the crown. A boatman may think mostly of current, cargo, and wind, yet his labour helps make royal command practical. At the centre of this order is Memphis, the great administrative heart near the meeting point of Upper and Lower Egypt. Its location is not accidental. From there, royal power can look north toward the delta and south along the valley. It sits where river traffic, agricultural wealth, political symbolism, and desert routes can be managed together. The city itself has left fewer visible remains than its importance deserves. Because mud brick decays and later settlement buries or reuses the traces of earlier life. This is one of the quiet frustrations of Egyptian archaeology. Stone preserves royal ambition, while mud brick often preserves the world that actually ran the kingdom, and mud brick is far more vulnerable to time. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that Memphis is not merely a capital in a ceremonial sense. It is a machine for turning a landscape into an organized state. That machine depends on writing. The Old Kingdom does not have writing in the modern bureaucratic sense of endless documents, preserved in archives for historians to read at leisure, but it has enough scribal practice to transform authority, a mark on a seal, a title carved in a tomb, a short account, a label, a ration list, a reference to an estate or office. These small things show how power becomes record. Scribes are not decorative figures, they are essential technicians of rule. They count grain, labour, livestock, cloth, oil, tools, and offerings. They help make the invisible visible. A field can be measured, a harvest can be assessed, a worker can receive rations, a temple can claim income. A provincial official can display rank through titles that connect him to the king. One lesser-known detail is that ancient Egyptian administration is full of titles whose exact functions are sometimes still debated. Some sound grand and clear at first glance, but their practical duties may shift over time or vary by context. A person can be attached to royal works, priestly service, record-keeping, local management, or provisioning, and the title alone does not always reveal the full reality of the job. scholars still debate how much certain offices represented active duties, honorary status, inherited privilege, or combinations of all three. This uncertainty matters because the Old Kingdom is not a modern state with departments that can be cleanly mapped. It is a web of households, royal institutions, temples, estates, kinship, service, and status, all tied together through the person of the king. The priests of the Old Kingdom also belong to this web. Modern imagination often separates religion from administration, but in Egypt that separation does not work. Temples need fields, offerings need herds, rituals need schedules, priests need income. A mortuary cult is both sacred and economic. When offerings are made for a dead king, they require bread, beer, cattle, birds, incense, linen, oil, and labour. These goods must come from somewhere. They pass through human hands. They are counted, transported, stored, prepared, presented, and consumed. Religion does not float above the economy. It organizes part of it. The farmer's world is therefore inseparable from the king's pyramid. The growing season follows the flood, the emergence of fields, the sowing, the tending, and the harvest. In good years, granaries swell, taxes can be collected, labour can be mobilized, and surplus can move into royal and temple systems. In weaker years, pressure spreads quickly, but during the strong phases of the Old Kingdom, the annual rhythm of agriculture gives the crown an extraordinary advantage. Because the flood season temporarily changes the agricultural calendar, labour can be redirected at certain times without necessarily removing everyone from active field work at the same moment. This does not make pyramid construction easy, and it does not mean ordinary people felt no burden. It means the state learns to work with the pulse of the river. Craftsmen turn that pulse into objects. The Old Kingdom is full of skilled workstone vessels carved with astonishing precision, copper tools, wooden sledges, ropes, pottery, faience, statues, reliefs, baskets, mats, boats, and painted tomb scenes. Craft production ranges from village-level activity to highly organized royal workshops. The pyramid builders need stonecutters and haulers, but they also need people who make bread molds, water jars, ropes, sled runners, baskets for carrying debris, and the everyday containers that keep food moving. Large monuments are built from small necessities repeated thousands of times. A pyramid is not only an architectural project, it is a supply chain. The river holds the supply chain together. Boats are the great vehicles of Old Kingdom power. The Nile can carry heavy materials more efficiently than desert roads. Limestone, granite, basalt, timber, food, officials, and messages all move along waterways. The season of inundation can help bring boats closer to places that are dry at other times. The royal state uses this geography with remarkable intelligence. Quarries are opened, expeditions move into deserts. Trade and exchange reach beyond the valley for materials Egypt does not possess in abundance. Cedar from the Levant, copper from Sinai, hard stones from remote quarries, and luxury goods from distant regions all enter the symbolic world of kingship. The pyramids may look local, but they are built by a society with far-reaching connections. Still, the Old Kingdom is not held together only by force or wealth. It is held together by an idea of order that makes hierarchy feel cosmic. The king stands at the top, but below him officials compete for status by serving him, being near him, and being remembered in relation to him. Tombs of elite officials near royal pyramids show this relationship in stone. To be buried close to the king is to remain close to power in death. To display titles is to make a life legible to eternity. To show scenes of estates, offerings, hunting, workshops, and servants is not simply to boast. It is to present a complete world of provision, a world in which the tomb owner continues to receive what he needs because order has been properly arranged. And yet this world contains a tension from the beginning. The Old Kingdom's strength depends on concentration. It draws resources toward the court, toward royal monuments, toward the ideology of divine kingship, but it also depends on delegation. The king cannot personally measure every field, inspect every village, supervise every granary, or command every boat. He needs officials. Those officials need local knowledge. Local knowledge gives them influence. Influence can become family power. Family power can take root in provinces. The very system that allows the Old Kingdom to function across Egypt also creates the possibility that authority, over time, will become less tightly centered. For now, in the great age of pyramid building, the balance still holds. Memphis commands, the river carries, farmers produce, scribes count, priests maintain the sacred circuits, and craftsmen turn raw material into forms meant to outlast decay. The king's death becomes a national act of construction. The desert edge becomes a stage on which Egypt tells itself that order is permanent. But permanence is always the most dangerous illusion in ancient states. The Old Kingdom is strong because so many moving parts align. Its mystery begins with the fact that alignment can be mistaken for inevitability. What looks eternal from the desert plateau is, in truth, a living arrangement renewed year after year by water, labour, obedience, skill, and trust. At the height of the Pyramid Age, royal power does not simply build monuments, it organises the visible world around the idea that the king is the axis of creation. The desert edge becomes a sacred border, a place where cultivated Egypt meets the silent West, where the living land gives way to the realm of the dead, and where the ruler's body is transformed into something more enduring than flesh. To modernize, a pyramid can seem like a single object, one enormous geometric statement against the sky. To Old Kingdom Egypt, it is closer to a complete landscape of power. It has a valley temple near the cultivated edge, a causeway rising toward the desert plateau, a mortuary temple pressed against the pyramid itself, subsidiary tombs, ritual courts, storage areas, boat burials, offering places, satellite pyramids, and cemeteries for officials who wish to remain near royal eternity. The pyramid is the centre, but the complex around it is the machine. This is why the Old Kingdom's greatest pyramids cannot be understood only as tombs. They are tombs, certainly, and the king's burial remains central to their meaning, but they are also engines of administration, faith, labour, memory, and state identity. A pyramid complex gathers resources while the king lives, and after he dies, it keeps gathering them through a mortuary cult designed to continue indefinitely. Priests serve the dead ruler, estates provide offerings, scribes record deliveries, workers maintain buildings. Ritual specialists speak words and perform acts meant to keep the king effective in the afterlife. The monument is not finished when the last stone is set. In a sense, that is when its long economic life begins. During the Fourth Dynasty, this system reaches a level of ambition that still resists easy explanation. Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure belong to a sequence of royal building that transforms Egypt's western desert into a statement of almost overwhelming confidence. Sneferu experiments on a colossal scale, leaving behind not one simple solution, but a record of architectural learning, adjustment, and persistence. At Medium, at the Bent Pyramid, and at the Red Pyramid. The Egyptian state seems to rehearse the language of eternity until it finds a form that can bear the full weight of royal ideology. By the time Khufu's Great Pyramid rises at Giza, the form has become devastatingly clear. Stone, geometry, labour, and kingship fuse into a monument that appears less built than imposed upon the horizon. Yet the Great Pyramid is not a miracle outside history. It is the result of knowledge accumulated through trial, administration refined over generations, quarrying planned with discipline, and labour organised with a precision that does not require fantasy to be astonishing. Blocks are extracted, shaped, moved, lifted, set, checked, and aligned. Food must arrive before hunger disrupts work. Tools must be supplied before stonecutters stand idle. Water must be carried. Ramps or working platforms maintained. Crews supervised, and injuries treated. Every part of this operation depends on planning. What survives in the record suggests that the workers were not a faceless mass, but organised groups with identities, names, ranks, and pride. Some crew names preserved in quarry marks and workmen's traces carry playful or loyal references to kings, reminding us that the builders were human beings inside an institution, not shadows moving stones in silence. A lesser-known but powerful detail is that some of the most intimate evidence for pyramid construction comes not from the polished exterior, but from hidden marks never meant to be seen by later eyes. Red-painted notations, gang names, control marks, and construction traces appear in places sealed within the monument or left in working contexts. They are not grand inscriptions for eternity. They are practical marks from the building process. Their survival is almost accidental, and because of that, they feel strangely alive. The finished pyramid proclaims divine order. The hidden marks reveal hands at work, decisions being made, crews being tracked, and the enormous monument becoming manageable through smaller acts of organisation. The peak of pyramid power is also the peak of royal visibility. The king is not simply buried in isolation. Around him, an entire elite community arranges itself in death. Mastaba tombs of princes, high officials, administrators, and royal relatives gather near the pyramid fields. Their placement is political as well as devotional. Proximity to the king matters. To rest near the royal pyramid is to remain within the gravitational field of power. In life, these officials helped govern Egypt. In death, their tombs display their titles, their estates, their offerings, and the ordered abundance they wish to continue forever. The cemeteries around the pyramids become frozen maps of Old Kingdom hierarchy. This hierarchy is not merely decorative. It reflects the way the state sees itself. At the top stands the king, whose pyramid is both his tomb and his cosmic instrument. Below him are members of the royal family and the highest officials, then layers of administrators, priests, overseers, scribes, and specialists whose identities are tied to service. The tombs tell a story of rank, but they also reveal dependence. Elite afterlife is bound to royal order. A noble's hope for remembrance is strengthened by closeness to the king. A priest's livelihood can be attached to royal foundations. An official's status grows from the titles granted by the palace. At the height of the system, royal power appears to distribute meaning itself. The religious dimension deepens this authority. The king's pyramid is linked to the sky, to the sun, to the imperishable stars, and to ideas of rebirth that shift and develop over time. The exact theology is not static, and scholars still debate how different solar, stellar, and Osirian elements developed across the Old Kingdom and after it. but the central idea remains powerful. The king's death is not an end that weakens Egypt. Properly managed, it becomes a transformation that helps sustain cosmic order. The pyramid makes that transformation visible. It gives the dead king a place from which he can continue to matter. By the 5th dynasty, royal building changes in form but remains deeply connected to power. Pyramids are still built, though generally smaller than the greatest monuments of the 4th dynasty, and sun temples become especially important for certain kings. This does not mean kingship suddenly becomes weak. It means the language of royal ideology broadens. Solar worship, temple endowments, and priestly institutions become increasingly visible. The king's relationship to the sun god gains new architectural expression. Power is not only measured in the size of a pyramid, but in the networks of cult, land, priesthood, and administration that keep royal memory active. The pyramid complex therefore functions like a permanent claim on the country. It says that the king has commanded labour in life, but it also says that his name will continue to command resources in death. This is the brilliance and the danger of the system. At its peak, it binds Egypt together. Villages contribute, officials organise, priests perform, artists decorate, boatmen transport, quarrymen cut, farmers produce. The whole land becomes part of a ritual economy that presents the king's eternity as the guarantee of everyone's order. The monument is not an isolated royal luxury. It is the dramatic centre of a national arrangement. But a national arrangement has to be maintained. Every offering table assumes grain. Every priestly rotation assumes support. Every estate assigned to a cult exists within a broader economy where land, labour, and produce are finite. When the state is strong and harvests are dependable, these obligations display abundance. They transform wealth into sacred permanence. Yet the very scale of the royal mortuary world hints at how much the Old Kingdom asks of itself. The pyramids are triumphs because they concentrate resources with extraordinary success. They also reveal how much concentration is required for the system to keep speaking in the language of eternity. Seen from the height of royal power, no collapse is visible yet. The causeways still gleam, the temples receive offerings, the scribes count. The cemeteries fill with confident images of provision. The king's name is carved into stone, sealed onto goods, and attached to institutions meant to survive generations. Egypt seems to have solved the problem that haunts all ancient societies: how to make power outlast the body that holds it. The answer is the pyramid complex, a machine of stone and ritual that turns death into administration, and administration into sacred memory. But beneath that achievement lies a quiet truth. The more magnificent the machine becomes, the more it depends on the uninterrupted cooperation of river, field, official, priest, worker, and king. At the peak of the Pyramid Age, Egypt looks immovable. Yet immovability is sometimes only what a system looks like before its hidden pressures become visible. The first cracks in the Pyramid Age are not dramatic. They do not begin with flames over Memphis or armies breaking through palace gates. They begin in the quieter places where ancient states are most vulnerable in accounts that must balance, estates that must keep producing, officials whose families become difficult to replace, rituals that demand goods long after the kings who founded them are gone, and local powers that grow stronger because the centre needs them to function. The stones of the pyramids remain straight and massive, but beneath them the living structure of the Old Kingdom is never as solid as the monuments make it appear. A pyramid can stand for thousands of years after its builders vanish. A bureaucracy must be fed every season. By the later Old Kingdom, Egypt has learned how to govern through layers. The king's command travels outward through officials, scribes, overseers, priests, and provincial administrators. This is a strength, because no ruler can manage an entire river valley alone. Delegation turns royal authority into daily practice. It lets the state collect taxes, organize labor, supervise irrigation, provision expeditions, manage herds, and maintain temples far from the palace. But delegation also changes the nature of power. Every person trusted to act for the king acquires knowledge, relationships, and local influence. Every office that begins as service can become a family asset. Every provincial post creates a point where royal command must pass through human ambition before it becomes action. The Old Kingdom's officials are not faceless servants. They are men of rank, memory, and lineage, eager to secure their place in this world and the next. Their tombs tell us this with impressive clarity. They list titles, they show estates, they present scenes of abundance, craft, procession, hunting, agriculture, and offering. They turn a career into a permanent statement. Early in the Pyramid Age, elite identity is strongly pulled toward the king. The highest officials often cluster near royal cemeteries, close to the court and to the sacred gravity of the pyramid complex. Over time, however, provincial tombs become more prominent in their own regions. Local governors and powerful families begin to carve their memory into cliffs and cemeteries far from Memphis, as if their authority no longer needs to be expressed only through closeness to the king. This does not mean rebellion is immediately underway. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how quickly provincial autonomy increased, how much was encouraged by the crown, and how much emerged from necessity. The king may have benefited from strong local administrators, especially in regions where agricultural management, taxation, and labor organization required people who understood local conditions. A powerful governor could serve the state well. The difficulty is that the same governor could also become the center of a local network of loyalty. His family could marry into regional elites. His tomb could dominate the local landscape. His titles could accumulate. His office could begin to look less like a temporary appointment and more like a rooted power base. There is a subtle shift here, but it is one of the most important in the story. The Old Kingdom does not weaken only because enemies attack it from outside. It weakens because the relationship between center and province becomes harder to control. In a highly centralized system, the palace is the great collector and redistributor. It draws in agricultural surplus and converts it into monuments, salaries, rations, rituals, gifts, and authority. But if more wealth and prestige remain in provincial hands, or if local offices become hereditary in practice, then the center's ability to command the whole country may slowly thin. The king may still be divine, his name may still be carved, his pyramid may still rise in the west, but orders become less powerful when the people who execute them have their own foundations of authority. The mortuary cults of earlier kings add another kind of pressure. Each pyramid complex is meant to keep functioning after the ruler's death. That is its purpose. Offerings must continue, priests must serve, estates assigned to the cult must produce, buildings must be maintained, at least in ideal terms. The dead king remains ritually alive, and his cult remains socially and economically active. In the short term, this strengthens kingship. It turns royal memory into an institution. In the long term, it may create a landscape crowded with sacred obligations. A living king does not inherit an empty state. He inherits the monuments and cults of his predecessors, each with claims on land, labor, produce, and personnel. This is one of the strange burdens of success. The more magnificent the old kingdom becomes, the more it has to maintain. A small royal tomb may require little. A vast pyramid complex with temples, priests, estates, and attached personnel becomes a permanent claimant within the economy. The exact scale of this burden is still debated, and it would be too simple to imagine the entire state bankrupted by the dead. Yet the broader point remains important. Old Kingdom kingship is cumulative. It builds memory into institutions, and institutions are rarely weightless. The past does not stay behind. It continues eating bread, drinking beer, receiving cattle, employing priests, occupying land, and shaping the choices of the present. At the same time, bureaucracy grows. This, too, is both strength and strain. A state that can count is a state that can build. A state that can record is a state that can remember obligations, measure fields, distribute rations, and maintain control across distance. But every layer of administration also requires people, training, privilege, and reward. Officials expect compensation. Offices develop status. Families tied to administration can become entrenched. The written order of the kingdom, once a tool of royal concentration, can become a pathway for elite reproduction. Those who know how the system works are the ones most able to benefit from it. A lesser-known detail of Old Kingdom society is how much of its political history must be reconstructed from titles and tomb placement, rather than from long narrative accounts. Egypt did not leave us a continuous official history explaining how authority changed from year to year. Instead, scholars often track shifts through where people are buried, what titles they claim, how tomb decoration changes, which institutions are named, and how royal monuments compare across generations. This makes the story more difficult and more interesting. The cracks are not always visible as events. They appear as patterns. A title becomes common. A provincial cemetery grows richer. A royal pyramid becomes smaller. A mortuary cult receives endowments. A local official begins to sound less like a servant of the palace and more like the master of his own landscape. The ideology of kingship also faces a quiet problem. The king is supposed to embody order, but order must be experienced to remain convincing. When harvests are good, when officials cooperate, when monuments rise, and when offerings flow, royal ideology seems confirmed by the world itself. The divine king appears effective because the country works. But if the machinery of state becomes more strained, if local officials grow more independent, if resources are harder to gather, or if the royal court can no longer build with the same confidence, then the symbolic centre begins to lose some of its force. Ideology does not disappear at once. Egyptians continue to believe deeply in kingship, ritual, and cosmic order. But belief and administration must reinforce one another. When they drift apart, even sacred authority can become less practical. This is why the end of the Pyramid Age should not be imagined as a simple failure of ambition. The kings do not stop wanting eternity. The priests do not stop performing rituals. The officials do not stop valuing rank. The farmers do not stop depending on the flood. The problem is that the arrangement binding all these parts together becomes more fragile. The state has expanded its obligations, empowered its agents, and tied its legitimacy to a demanding form of monumental and ritual performance. It has created a beautiful machine, but that machine requires constant inputs: grain, labour, loyalty, transport, competent succession, administrative discipline, and environmental cooperation. For a long time, the machine works. That is what makes its weakening so difficult to see while it's happening. Ancient states rarely announce their own vulnerability. They continue carving titles, sealing jars, burying officials, making offerings, and speaking the language of order. But beneath the surface, pressure can accumulate quietly. The royal court depends on provincial strength while fearing provincial independence. The living king depends on the cults of dead kings while competing with their claims on resources. The bureaucracy depends on expertise while creating powerful families. The pyramid proclaims unity, while the country beneath it becomes more complex, more layered, and perhaps less obedient to a single centre. Before the Nile begins to fail in memory and evidence, before later texts imagine hunger and disorder, the Pyramid Age already contains its own hidden strain. The stone is still standing. The system beneath it is beginning to feel its weight. The Nile is the quiet clock of the Old Kingdom, and when that clock begins to lose its rhythm, every part of Egypt feels the change. The court may speak in the language of eternity, but the fields speak in a more immediate language: water, silt, seed, grain, storage, ration, hunger, obligation. The pyramid builders can quarry stone, align passages, polish caisson blocks, and carve the names of kings into monuments meant to defeat time, but none of them can command the flood. Each year, Egypt waits for a force born far beyond the king's direct reach, in rains falling across distant highlands and river systems to the south. The flood comes as if it belongs to Egypt, yet its sources lie outside Egypt's control. That fact, so simple and so dangerous, sits beneath the whole Pyramid Age. In good years, the inundation is almost miraculous. The river rises, spreads over the floodplain, softens the land, leaves behind fertile silt, and prepares the fields for sowing. The valley's not wide, but it is intensely productive when water arrives in the right measure. Too little water means fields remain dry, basins do not fill properly, canals and lowlands fail to receive enough moisture, and grain yields fall. Too much water can also be destructive, damaging settlements and delaying work. Egypt's prosperity depends not merely on the Nile, but on a Nile that behaves within a narrow range of abundance. The Old Kingdom's genius lies partly in learning to organize that rhythm. Its vulnerability lies in depending on it. Near the end of the Old Kingdom, the possibility of weakened Nile floods becomes one of the most haunting clues in the entire mystery. Ancient Egypt leaves no neat annual spreadsheet of flood heights across all regions for historians to consult, and the evidence remains incomplete. But several lines of research have drawn attention to climatic instability around the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, roughly the period associated in wider scholarship with the so-called 4.2 kilo-year event. In some regions of the Near East and Northeast Africa, scholars have looked for signs of aridity, reduced rainfall, settlement disruption, changing lake levels, dust deposits, altered vegetation, and shifts in human occupation. Egypt is part of that broader conversation, but it must be handled carefully. The end of the Old Kingdom cannot be reduced to a single climatic label. This caution matters because the 4.2 kilo-year event has often been treated in popular writing almost like a global disaster button, pressed once and felt everywhere in the same way. That is not how climate works, and it is not how societies respond. Recent scholarship has emphasized that the evidence for a single, sharply defined, globally uniform event is uneven. Some regions show strong signs of change, others show weaker, ambiguous, or differently timed signals, even where aridity is visible. The connection between climate stress and political collapse has to be demonstrated, not assumed. For Egypt, reduced Nile floods may have been a serious pressure, but no single explanation fully accounts for the end of the Pyramid Age. Still, the Nile clue cannot be dismissed. Egypt's agricultural system is so closely tied to inundation that a series of poor floods could create consequences far beyond the fields. Grain is not just food, it is tax, salary, ration, temple offering, labour fuel, emergency reserve, and political trust. A low flood can mean smaller harvests. Smaller harvests can mean less surplus. Less surplus can mean difficulty feeding work crews, supporting officials, sustaining mortuary cults, provisioning temples, and redistributing goods in ways that make royal authority visible. When the Nile weakens, the king's power may not vanish, but it becomes harder to perform. The palace can still command, yet commands require material backing. A divine ruler still needs grain in the granary. The Blue Nile and other southern tributaries are especially important in this story, because much of the floodwater and fertile sediment reaching Egypt depends on rainfall far beyond the Egyptian valley itself. The king may reside near Memphis, but the force that nourishes his kingdom begins in weather systems that do not care about kings. This is one of the more sobering details of Old Kingdom power. Egypt's most centralized royal ideology rests on an environmental system that is profoundly decentralized. Clouds over distant mountains can affect the confidence of officials in Memphis, the rations of workers near a pyramid, the offerings in a temple, and the ambitions of governors in the provinces. The connection is indirect, but ancient states often break through indirect pressures. What survives in the record suggests that late Old Kingdom Egypt may have faced precisely this kind of pressure, not necessarily one catastrophic year, but perhaps a run of difficult years, uneven floods, regional shortages, or growing unpredictability. Some later Egyptian texts remember famine, social inversion, dry riverbeds, empty storehouses, and a world in which order appears to have failed. These texts are powerful, but they must not be read as simple eyewitness reports. Many were written later, shaped by literary convention, ideology, moral reflection, and the Egyptian habit of imagining chaos as the opposite of good kingship. Yet cultural memory does not emerge from nothing. Even if the details are stylized, they may preserve the emotional truth of a period when abundance could no longer be taken for granted. The most difficult task is linking environmental evidence to historical experience. A lake core may suggest aridity, a sediment record may hint at changing hydrology, a speleothem may preserve chemical traces of rainfall variation, a marine core may record dust or river discharge, archaeological settlement patterns may show stress, abandonment, or adaptation. But none of these automatically tells us how a farmer in Upper Egypt felt when the basin did not fill, or how a provincial governor negotiated tax obligations after a poor harvest, or how the court explained weak floods while still claiming to uphold cosmic order. The science gives patterns. The human story has to be reconstructed from partial traces. This is where the end of the Pyramid Age becomes more subtle than a disaster tale. If a powerful state is flexible, well supplied, and politically trusted, it may survive environmental stress. If it is already strained by heavy obligations, expanding local power, uncertain succession, and administrative complexity, the same stress can become far more dangerous. A weak Nile flood does not have to destroy Egypt by itself. It only has to expose weaknesses already present. It can force choices that were easier to avoid in times of abundance. Which cult receives offerings first? Which workers receive rations? Which provinces meet their tax quotas? Which local officials gain leverage because they control regional stores? Which promises of royal protection begin to sound less convincing? The Nile, then, does not act like an invading army. It acts like a tightening hand. A few poor years can make every obligation heavier. The mortuary cults of dead kings, once symbols of eternal continuity, become more difficult to sustain. Provincial officials who manage local resources become more important. The court's ability to redistribute abundance weakens if abundance itself shrinks. Farmers may still sow, priests may still chant, scribes may still count, but the numbers on the account become harder to satisfy. The system does not need to collapse immediately. It can become brittle. There is also the problem of regional difference. Egypt is long, and the effects of low floods may not have been identical everywhere. Some basins may suffer more than others. Some local officials may manage shortages more effectively. Some temples may retain resources. Some communities may adapt through storage, local exchange, or altered obligations. This unevenness may help explain why the Old Kingdom does not simply disappear into total darkness. Instead, central authority weakens while local power becomes more visible. The same environmental stress that undermines the palace may strengthen provincial leaders who can present themselves as protectors, providers, or practical managers in their own regions. At the level of ideology, weak floods create a dangerous silence. The king is supposed to uphold order. The world should respond. The Nile should rise. Fields should produce. Offerings should flow. When that chain falters, the problem is not only economic, it is symbolic. Egyptians did not necessarily blame every bad flood directly on the king in a simple way, and scholars still debate how ordinary people interpreted these events. But royal legitimacy depends on the appearance of effectiveness. A king who cannot guarantee abundance may remain sacred, yet his sacredness becomes harder to translate into confidence. The river's failure can make cosmic order feel less secure, so the Nile begins to fail not as a single dramatic scene, but as a pressure spreading through the hidden arteries of the state. It touches the field before it touches the palace. It touches grain before it touches stone. It touches local obligation before it touches royal ideology. And when it finally reaches the pyramids, it does so indirectly, through shrinking resources, reduced confidence, and a state less able to turn divine kingship into visible command. The desert monuments still stand. But the river that made them possible may no longer be offering the same promise. In that gap between eternal stone and uncertain water, the pyramid age begins to change. When the flood is low, the first sign is not always panic, it is measurement. A mark on a riverbank stands below hope. A basin fills more slowly than it should. A canal carries less water into a field that has known better seasons. Mud dries too early at the edge of cultivation. Men who have watched the Nile all their lives begin to understand, before any official announcement, that the year will be harder. Egypt is a country trained to read water. And in a land where the difference between abundance and want can be measured in the height of a flood, people do not need a royal decree to know when the river has disappointed them. The experience of a poor inundation begins close to the ground. The great monuments still sit on the desert edge, and the names of kings still carry sacred weight. But the farmer's attention is fixed on soil. If the flood does not spread far enough, some fields remain thirsty. If basins do not fill deeply enough, the moisture stored in the earth may not last. If the silt layer is thinner, the land may still produce, but not with the same confidence. The work of sowing continues. Because people do not abandon a season simply because it begins badly. They adjust. They choose fields more carefully. They conserve seed. They rely on stored grain where it exists. They seek help through kin, estate, temple, or local official. What survives in the record suggests that Egyptian society had mechanisms of storage, redistribution, and local resilience. But no mechanism is limitless. A weak flood turns ordinary routines into negotiations. Tax assessments that seemed manageable in a good year become heavy in a poor one. Grain owed to an estate, a temple, a royal institution, or a local authority still exists as an obligation, even if the field has yielded less. The scribe's account may not soften simply because the soil has, somewhere, a local administrator has to decide what can actually be collected, what must be deferred, what must be reported, and what must be hidden. The human reality of climate stress often lies in these spaces between expectation and yield. The state imagines a harvest in numbers. The village experiences it in baskets, storage jars, ration loaves, and the anxiety of how long supplies will last. In the Old Kingdom, grain is never just grain. It is the substance from which power is made visible. It feeds labour crews, it supports officials, it supplies offerings, it fills the magazines of temples and estates, it becomes bread and beer, the daily foundation of work and ritual. When harvests fall, the problem moves outward in circles. A household may tighten its consumption. A village may depend more heavily on stored reserves. A local estate may reduce what it can send upward. A temple may struggle to maintain the ideal flow of offerings. A work crew may require rations that are harder to provide. The palace may still speak with authority, but authority becomes more difficult when every order has to pass through a thinning supply of food. The people who feel this most directly are not the kings whose monuments dominate the horizon, but the communities whose labour and produce keep the state alive. Farmers, herders, potters, bakers, brewers, boatmen, scribes, and field overseers all live within the same fragile rhythm. A potter making bread moulds may find demand shifting if a large labour project's slow. A boatman may carry grain from regions that still have stores to regions under pressure. A baker serving a crew may stretch flour more carefully. A herder may face poorer grazing near the cultivated edge. A scribe may spend longer reconciling what is expected with what has actually arrived. These are not dramatic scenes in royal inscriptions, but they are the daily texture of a weakening system. The Old Kingdom has buffers. It is not a helpless society waiting passively for the river. Granaries matter. Local knowledge matters. Administrative networks matter. Large estates can store and redistribute. Temples and royal institutions can act as centres of consumption and perhaps relief. Though scholars still debate how far such support reached in moments of stress, communities may rely on family networks, exchange, and seasonal movement of goods. Egypt's long experience with fluctuating floods likely produced practical strategies for coping with difficult years, but repeated low inundations, if they occurred across several seasons or affected crucial regions, could push those strategies beyond comfort. Resilience is real, but it is not magic. One lesser-known aspect of this world is that the evidence for ordinary hardship is often indirect. The people most affected by poor harvests did not usually leave long personal accounts of their fear. Archaeologists and historians must read around the silent settlement patterns, storage facilities, burial changes, administrative titles, later literary memories, regional tomb inscriptions, and shifts in elite display. Sometimes the poor leave traces not by writing about crisis, but through changes in diet, settlement stability, material culture, or the absence of things that once appeared regularly. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness should make the story more careful, not less human. For local officials, low floods create both danger and opportunity. A governor or estate manager who can secure grain, organize canals, negotiate obligations, and maintain order becomes more valuable. People in his region may look to him not merely as a representative of the king, but as the person who actually manages survival. This does not require open rebellion. It only requires practical dependence. In good years, loyalty can flow smoothly upward, because abundance makes hierarchy easier to perform. In bad years, loyalty may become more local because help is needed nearby. The distant king remains sacred, but the local storehouse is closer. This is one way environmental stress can strengthen provincial power. A weak Nile does not have to break the kingdom directly. It can shift trust. If regional leaders are the ones who control access to grain, labour, waterworks, and local security, then their authority deepens. Their tombs may grow more ambitious. Their inscriptions may emphasize provision, care, and effectiveness. Later Egyptian traditions sometimes celebrate local officials who claim to have fed their towns in times of want. Such claims must be read cautiously, because elite tomb biographies often present their owners in ideal terms, yet even ideal language reveals what mattered. To say one fed the hungry or sustained a district is to claim a role that kingship itself was supposed to embody. At the household level, a poor harvest changes time. The future becomes shorter. Grain that should last until the next season may not. Animals that should be kept may have to be used sooner. Tools may be repaired rather than replaced. Offerings may be reduced. Debts or obligations may become more dangerous. People may remain outwardly within the same social order while inwardly living with less margin. Ancient states often endure not because everyone prospers, but because enough people can survive the bad years without the system losing legitimacy. When that margin narrows across too many places, the state's weakness becomes visible. The pyramid projects themselves would not be immune. Monumental construction depends on surplus and coordination. Labourers require rations. Specialists require support. Transport requires crews and animals. Administrators require authority backed by resources. If grain is scarce, the logic of massive construction changes. A king may still desire a pyramid, but desire cannot quarry stone or feed workers. This may help explain why later royal monuments become smaller and less imposing than the colossal achievements of the Fourth Dynasty, though monument size alone cannot prove famine or collapse. Architectural change has many causes, including ideology, resources, political strategy, and tradition. Still, the shrinking of royal tombs becomes part of the wider pattern the state continues to build, but not with the same overwhelming certainty. The most painful aspect of low floods is that they expose the distance between cosmic order and physical reality. Egyptian kingship promises stability, and ritual works to renew it, but the river answers to climate systems beyond human command. If the inundation fails, the world does not immediately stop believing in order. Instead, order becomes harder to maintain. Priests still perform rites, scribes still write, farmers still sow, officials still carry titles. But the background confidence changes. The state must now prove its effectiveness under pressure, and pressure reveals where power is real, where it is symbolic, and where it has already begun to drift away from the centre. So life when the floods are low is not one single image of disaster. It is a slow tightening of choices. It is a field that yields less, an account that does not balance, a ration that must stretch, a storehouse that becomes political, a local official whose importance grows, a royal command that travels into a countryside with less surplus to give. It is the moment when the Pyramid Age stops being only a story of stone and becomes a story of grain. And grain, unlike stone, does not last forever. As the pressure of uncertain floods spreads through fields and storehouses, power begins to gather in places that once seemed secondary to the royal court. Egypt has never been only Memphis and the pyramids. It is a long country divided by geography before it is divided by politics, a chain of districts running along the Nile, each with its own towns, estates, canals, cemeteries, local gods, leading families, and memories. The Egyptians later call these districts nomes, and the men who govern them are often described by modern scholars as nomarchs. In the strongest days of the Old Kingdom, these local authorities serve the king's system. They help convert royal command into practical administration. But near the end of the Pyramid Age, the same provincial structure that once carries central power outward begins to draw power inward, toward the regions themselves. This shift does not happen all at once, and it should not be imagined as a clean rebellion by ambitious governors against a helpless king. The evidence remains incomplete, and the surviving record is often biased toward elites who wanted to present themselves as successful, loyal, powerful, and blessed. Still, patterns begin to stand out. Provincial tombs become more important. Local officials display longer and more confident title sequences. Families remain attached to offices across generations. Cemeteries outside the royal orbit become richer expressions of status. The visual center of Egyptian power is still the pyramid field, but the social center is becoming less absolute. The countryside is learning to speak more loudly in stone. Earlier in the Old Kingdom, the highest prestige is closely tied to proximity to the king. Elite tombs cluster around royal pyramids because nearness to the ruler in death reflects nearness to power in life. But as the centuries pass, powerful officials increasingly build imposing tombs in their own provinces. This is one of the great clues to the changing kingdom. A tomb is not only a burial place, it is a declaration of identity. To carve a tomb into a local cliff, decorate it with scenes of estates and offerings, and fill it with titles rooted in regional authority is to say that memory no longer has to depend entirely on the royal cemetery. A man can be important where he comes from. His afterlife can be anchored in his district. His name can dominate his local landscape. This does not mean the king is forgotten. Provincial elites still often define themselves through royal service. They hold titles connected to the court, to royal commissions, to priesthoods, to expeditions, to taxation, and to administration. Their prestige still comes partly from the crown, but the balance changes. A governor who controls local land, labour, storage, and ritual becomes indispensable. His relationship with the king may remain formal and loyal, yet his practical authority is increasingly rooted among the people, estates, and temples of his own nome. Royal power must pass through him, and the more difficult conditions become, the more that passage matters. One of the more revealing details is the way provincial tomb biographies begin to emphasize acts of provision and local care. Some officials claim to have fed their towns, protected their people, managed resources, or ensured that no one lacked basic support. Such statements are not neutral reporting. They belong to the ideal language of elite self-presentation, and scholars still debate how directly they reflect real crisis. But the choice of boast is itself meaningful. In a society where the king is supposed to guarantee order, a local official who presents himself as the feeder and protector of his district is stepping into a role with deep political weight. He is not necessarily denying the king. He is showing that, in practical terms, order can be local. The geography of Egypt encourages this possibility. The Nile unifies the country, but distance still matters. A command from Memphis has to travel. Goods have to move. Officials have to negotiate with local realities. Upper Egypt, with its narrow valley, regional centres, desert routes, and access to Nubian trade and expedition paths, is not the same as the Delta or the Memphite region. Some governors manage frontier relationships. Others oversee agricultural districts. Others are linked to priesthoods of local gods. In such a world, authority is never merely vertical, it is also embedded. A provincial ruler who knows the canals, the families, the estates, the priests, and the desert tracts possesses a form of power that the palace needs but cannot fully own. The 6th dynasty offers especially vivid glimpses of this provincial world. Officials in the south, including those connected with Elephantine and the routes beyond Egypt, show how royal service can be carried out far from the centre. Expeditions move toward Nubia and beyond. Goods, soldiers, interpreters, boat crews, and desert knowledge become part of statecraft. Men like these are agents of the king, but they also become regional figures with reputations that outlast the immediate mission. Their tombs preserve not only loyalty to the crown but a sense of local importance, a record of careers made at the edges of Egypt's direct control. The farther power travels, the more it depends on those who know the road. Provincial religion also strengthens local identity. Every nome has sacred landscapes and gods whose importance may be old, deep, and emotionally immediate. The king remains the supreme ritual figure of Egypt, but local temples and priesthood shape daily religious life. As provincial elites become more prominent, their connection to local cults can reinforce their authority. A governor is not only an administrator, he may be a priest, patron, builder, donor, and ritual figure in his own region. This layering matters because political power in Egypt rarely appears as politics alone. It appears through religion, tomb display, food distribution, land control, and the careful management of memory. The central state may have encouraged some of this development. Strong local administration is useful. It allows the king to govern a long country without managing every detail from Memphis. It helps collect resources and organize labor. It gives the court trusted agents in distant areas. But what is useful in one century can become dangerous in another. If offices become hereditary, if local families accumulate wealth, if provincial tombs become grander, if temple networks deepen regional identity, and if the palace faces economic or environmental stress, then the governor is no longer merely a conduit of royal power. He becomes an alternative focus of loyalty. This transformation does not require a sudden ideological break. Egypt can remain culturally united even as political authority fragments. People can still share language, religious assumptions, artistic conventions, burial beliefs, and memories of kingship while living under more localized power. That is one reason the idea of collapse needs care. The Old Kingdom's central structure weakens, but Egypt does not become empty. Villages still plant, craftsmen still work, tombs are still built, offerings are still imagined, local elites still seek eternity. What changes is the scale at which authority feels dependable. The great royal centre loses some of its grip, and the provinces become less like the edges of the kingdom and more like its competing foundations. The movement of power to the provinces also changes the meaning of the pyramids themselves. Once, they are the supreme gravitational centres of elite aspiration. To be near the king is to be near order. But as provincial tombs grow in significance, eternity becomes more regionally distributed. The dead no longer gather only around the royal mountain. They also gather around local cliffs, local cemeteries, local gods, local families. Stone memory spreads away from the center. The king's pyramid still dominates the horizon, but the horizon of ambition has widened. This is the quiet political drama of the late Old Kingdom. A state built on centralization survives by delegating power. Delegated power becomes local strength. Local strength becomes regional identity. Regional identity becomes the seed of fragmentation when the center can no longer command the same resources, confidence, or obedience as before. The Nile may have tightened the pressures, but the provinces show where those pressures found room to act. In the long valley of Egypt. The end of the Pyramid Age is not only a story of a weakened palace, it is also the story of many smaller centers becoming strong enough to matter. In the long story of the Old Kingdom, few figures carry as much symbolic weight as Pepi II. He stands near the end of the 6th dynasty like a human bridge between confidence and exhaustion, between the old language of divine kingship and the more fractured world that follows. His reign is traditionally remembered as extraordinarily long, perhaps among the longest in ancient history, though scholars still debate the exact number of years and the reliability of later king lists. The figure sometimes given in ancient tradition is so vast that it feels almost legendary. Yet even if the reign was shorter than the most extreme claims, it appears to have been unusually extended, and that matters. A long reign can be a gift to a kingdom. It can offer stability, continuity, and time for institutions to mature. But when a system is already under strain, too much continuity can become its own kind of danger. Pepi II likely comes to the throne very young. After the reigns of Teti, Uzakare, Pepi I, and Merenre I have already shaped the 6th dynasty into a more complex and regionally connected state. His minority, if reconstructed correctly, means that early power must have passed through regents, royal women, senior officials, and court factions who govern in the king's name while the sacred body of kingship is still growing into adulthood. This is not unusual in monarchies, and it does not automatically mean weakness. Ancient states often know how to manage young rulers, but it does mean that the machinery around the throne matters enormously. The palace, the family, the officials, the priesthoods, and the provincial governors all become crucial in sustaining the appearance and operation of royal order. One of the most vivid surviving glimpses of Pepi II comes from the career of Harkuf, a governor and expedition leader from Elephantine in the far south. Harkuf travels beyond Egypt's southern frontier toward Nubia and deeper African regions, bringing back exotic goods, political knowledge, and prestige. In his tomb autobiography, a letter from the young king is preserved in which Pepi II shows intense interest in a rare performer brought from distant lands. The detail is often remembered because it feels unexpectedly human. Behind the divine titles and royal rituals, there is a young ruler fascinated by marvels arriving from the edge of the known world. But the same episode also reveals something more structural. The king's world still reaches far. The court still values southern expeditions. Provincial officials like Harkuf are essential agents of royal ambition. The Old Kingdom is not yet a broken system. It is still active, curious, and outward-looking. That is part of the puzzle. Pepi II's reign is not simply a decline from the beginning. Egypt continues to function. Expeditions continue. Officials continue to serve. Tombs continue to be decorated. The king's pyramid is built at South Saqqara, with its temples and inscriptions maintaining the sacred language of kingship. The pyramid texts continue to shape the royal afterlife, presenting the dead king's ascent, transformation, and power in a tradition that has developed across several reigns. The court still knows how to speak eternity, yet beneath that continuity, the balance of the kingdom may be changing in ways that become clearer only later. A reign lasting many decades creates a particular political problem. Generations of officials rise, mature, and die under the same king. Sons may inherit positions once held by fathers. Provincial families have time to deepen their roots. Administrative habits become entrenched. Local authority can harden into expectation. When a king rules for a normal span, succession renews the court's networks. New rulers reward supporters, reorganize offices, shift balances, and reassert control. But under a very long reign, renewal may slow. The same royal name presides while the people around the throne change again and again. The king becomes a constant symbol, but perhaps less of an active reshaper of power. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be too simple to blame Pepi II personally for the end of the Old Kingdom. Ancient collapse stories often turn old rulers into symbols of decay, as if the aging body of the king explains the weakening of the state. Reality is rarely that neat. A long reign does not cause low Nile floods. It does not single-handedly create provincial ambition. It does not invent the economic demands of mortuary cults or the administrative complexity of a large kingdom. But it may intensify the effects of those pressures. If the king grows old while the provinces grow stronger, if succession becomes uncertain while resources become tighter, if senior offices become more deeply tied to powerful families, then the royal centre may lose the ability to reset the system at the very moment when reset is most needed. There is also the issue of succession after Pepi II. The historical record becomes difficult, and names appear in later sources with varying degrees of certainty. Mercenary II is often placed after him, but his reign seems brief. The figure of Nitocris appears in later tradition, though her historicity and role are debated, and she should not be treated as a clear final ruler whose story neatly explains the fall. The uncertainty itself is revealing. Earlier Old Kingdom sequences, though not without problems, feel more solid. Near the end, the royal line becomes harder to trace. Short reigns, gaps, disputed names, and later memory all suggest a period in which kingship remains meaningful but less stable in practice. This is where Pepi II becomes less a villain than a hinge. Under him, the Old Kingdom still performs its ancient identity. The king remains the son of the sun, the lord of ritual, the centre of cosmic order. His officials still pursue rank through service. His pyramid still receives the language of ascension. His court still communicates with distant frontiers. But the kingdom around him is not the same as the kingdom of Khufu. Royal monuments are smaller. Provincial elites are more visible. The administrative web is more layered. The economic obligations of past kings have accumulated. Environmental uncertainty may be pressing harder against the grain system. The Nile, the provinces, the bureaucracy, and the dead all exert pressure on the living king. A lesser-known feature of this late Old Kingdom world is that some royal decrees survive from the period, protecting temples, personnel, or estates from certain obligations. Such decrees show a king still issuing commands, still intervening in institutional life, still shaping the relationship between the crown and sacred foundations. But they may also hint at negotiation. If a temple or institution needs exemption, protection, or privilege written into royal order, then administration is not simply flowing effortlessly. It is being managed, adjusted, and defended. Decrees are signs of authority. but they also reveal pressure points. Power often leaves its clearest traces where it has to insist on itself. By the end of Pepi II's long presence, Egypt may have been accustomed to stability in the form of one royal name, yet unprepared for what happens when that name disappears. The death of any king requires transition. The death of a king who has ruled for decades can feel like the removal of a pillar everyone has forgotten is load-bearing. Officials who built their careers under him must reposition themselves. Provincial leaders may calculate their own strength. Competing claimants or fragile successors may struggle to reassert unity. The state still has its rituals, but rituals need a functioning political body around them. So Pepi II's long reign becomes one of the most haunting elements in the end of the Pyramid Age because it contains both endurance and weakness. It shows that the Old Kingdom does not simply fail because it is short-lived or poorly organized. It lasts. It adapts. It reaches far south, writes decrees, builds monuments, and maintains royal theology across generations. But endurance can hide transformation. A system may remain recognizable, while its foundations shift beneath it. By the time the long reign ends, the pyramid still stands, the king is still divine, and Egypt is still Egypt. Yet the old center no longer holds the country with the same unquestioned force. The throne survives the man, but not the age that made his authority seem immovable. By the time the Old Kingdom moves beyond the long shadow of Pepi II, the pyramids themselves begin to speak in a different voice. They still rise in the desert, still claim the West as royal ground, still bind the dead king to the sky and the divine order of Egypt. But the overwhelming certainty of the earlier age is no longer there. The monuments become smaller, their construction is less commanding, their settings feel more vulnerable to loss, reuse, erosion, and neglect. The language of kingship continues, yet the material confidence behind that language appears reduced. It is as if Egypt is still reciting the old formula, but the breath behind the words has weakened. This change should not be misunderstood as a simple line of decline from greatness to failure. Pyramid building had already evolved across the Old Kingdom. Sneferu's experiments were not the same as Khufu's precision, and Khufu's colossal statement was not the same as the later 5th Dynasty world of smaller pyramids and solar temples. Monument size alone cannot measure political health. A smaller pyramid may reflect a different religious emphasis, a different architectural tradition, a different royal strategy, or changing priorities rather than poverty. Scholars still debate how much should be read into the changing scale and quality of late Old Kingdom royal tombs, but the broad pattern remains difficult to ignore. The age of the colossal pyramid as the supreme expression of royal power does not last. The state keeps building, but it no longer builds with the same almost impossible concentration of resources. Earlier pyramids dominate not only through size, but through control. The 4th Dynasty monuments project an image of centralized command so complete that the landscape seems disciplined by royal will. At Giza, the arrangement of pyramid, temples, causeways, cemeteries, quarries, and settlement creates a world planned around kingship. By the late Old Kingdom, pyramid complexes still matter deeply, but they do not transform the horizon in the same way. Their masonry is often less massive, their internal structures more vulnerable, their surrounding institutions less able to preserve them from later decay. The difference is not just architectural, it suggests that the relationship between royal ambition and national capacity has changed. A revealing clue lies in the pyramid texts. These sacred writings, first known from the Pyramid of Unas at the end of the 5th Dynasty, and then used in later royal pyramids, fill burial chambers and corridors with spells, utterances, and ritual language designed to guide and empower the dead king. Their appearance is one of the most important religious developments of the Old Kingdom. Earlier pyramids had relied on architecture, placement, ritual, and perhaps oral tradition to express royal transformation. Now the interior walls themselves speak. The king's ascent to the sky, his union with divine forces, his triumph over death, his continued power among gods and stars, all of this becomes inscribed inside the monument. This is not a sign of weakness in any simple sense. The pyramid texts are rich, complex, and theologically profound. They show an increasingly elaborate royal afterlife and a scribal culture capable of fixing sacred speech in stone. But they also shift the nature of the monument. The pyramid is no longer only a vast exterior form of power. Its inner chambers become dense with ritual language, as if eternity now depends not merely on mass and geometry, but on words, formulas, and carefully preserved sacred knowledge. The spoken and written spell begins to share the burden once carried so dramatically by sheer scale. There is something deeply human in that change. When power is most confident, it often builds outward, large enough for everyone to see. When confidence becomes more uncertain, it may turn inward, protecting meaning in chambers hidden from the sun. This is not proof of collapse, but it is a powerful image for the late Pyramid Age. The outside shrinks. The inside speaks more intensely. The royal tomb remains sacred, but its message is no longer the same as Khufu's vast limestone mountain. It is more textual, more enclosed, more dependent on ritual precision. It suggests continuity, but continuity under altered conditions. The quality of construction also matters. Later pyramids often suffer more severely over time because of differences in materials and methods. Some use cores of smaller blocks, rubble, or less durable arrangements, covered by finer casing that later disappears. Once the casing is stripped away, the inner body is more exposed to destruction. From a distance, it is easy to see this as simple incompetence, but that would be unfair. Builders still possessed skill, priests still understood ritual, architects still knew the symbolic grammar of royal burial. The question is not whether Egyptians forgot how to build. The question is whether the state could still afford to build in the same way, with the same resources, labor discipline, quarrying intensity, and political command that earlier monuments required. The answer seems to be no, not suddenly, not absolutely, but increasingly. The pyramid becomes a clue to the changing scale of royal power. The court can still organize construction, but perhaps with fewer resources. It can still command labor, but perhaps with less reach. It can still support mortuary cults, but perhaps with more competition from older foundations, provincial institutions, and local elites. The dead king still needs eternity, but the living kingdom has more demands pressing upon it. A late Old Kingdom pyramid may therefore represent both persistence and limitation. It says, the old ideal still matters. It also says, the old capacity is no longer the same. Around the royal monuments, the broader funerary landscape reinforces this impression. Provincial cemeteries continue to gain importance. Elite tombs away from the Memphite center become more expressive of local status. Officials still use the artistic language of order and abundance, but their self-presentation increasingly reflects regional authority. The royal pyramid no longer monopolizes the imagination of eternity as completely as before. In earlier generations, the king's tomb is the supreme anchor of elite afterlife. In the late Old Kingdom, eternity has spread. It has become more local, more dispersed, more tied to provincial landscapes and family power. A lesser-known but striking detail is that the end of the monumental certainty is visible not only in what is built, but in what later happens to what was built. Mortuary temples can lose support, cults can decline, stone can be robbed, names can survive in fragments while institutions disappear. The ideal Egyptian mortuary system imagines perpetual care, but archaeology shows that perpetuity is difficult. Buildings decay when people stop maintaining them. Offerings cease when estates fail or are redirected. Priests vanish from the record when their income disappears. The dead king's eternity depends on the living, and the living are always negotiating scarcity, politics, and time. This makes the late Pyramid Age especially poignant. The Egyptians build for forever, but forever requires administration. It requires deliveries that arrive not once, but year after year. It requires officials who respect old assignments, priests who continue old rites, land that continues producing, and a state strong enough to defend sacred obligations from erosion. When the central kingdom weakens, eternity becomes more fragile. The stone may remain, but the ritual life around it can fade. A pyramid without its functioning cult is still magnificent to modernize, but to ancient Egypt it is a damaged machine. The visible decline of royal monuments therefore does not stand apart from climate, administration, and provincial power. It gathers them into one image. If the Nile is less reliable, surplus is harder to concentrate. If officials are more locally rooted, labour and wealth are harder to draw toward the court. If older mortuary cults continue to claim resources, each new king faces a more crowded sacred economy. If succession becomes unstable, long-term projects may lose momentum. If ideology remains strong but material support weakens, monuments may preserve the language of certainty while revealing its limits. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the pyramid is no longer the unquestioned proof that the king can gather the country into one act of stone. It is a reminder of what that act once required. The monuments do not stop mattering. In some ways, they matter more, because they hold the memory of a system under strain. Each smaller pyramid, each damaged temple, each provincial tomb gaining confidence beyond the old centre, adds another layer to the same story. Egypt has not forgotten eternity. It has not abandoned kingship. It has not lost its sacred imagination. But the age when royal power could remake the desert on the larger scale is passing. The desert still receives the kings. It simply no longer receives them with the same thunder. To call the end of the Old Kingdom a collapse is both useful and dangerous. It is useful because something real breaks. The centralized power that had raised the Great Pyramids, organized royal mortuary landscapes, and projected the king's authority across the Nile Valley no longer functions in the same way. The old confidence fades. The royal sequence becomes harder to follow. Provincial elites become louder. Monuments shrink. Institutions strain. And the kingdom enters a period of political division that later memory treats as a time of disorder. Yet the word collapse is dangerous because it can make the past sound emptier than it was. Egypt does not disappear. The Nile still flows. Fields are still planted. People still marry, worship, trade, bury their dead, repair tools, bake bread, and imagine order. The end of a state is not the end of a civilization. This distinction matters deeply for the Pyramid Age. The Old Kingdom is a political and ideological structure, not the whole of Egyptian life. When its central machinery weakens, the country does not fall into a blank void. Instead, power becomes more regional, more negotiated, more uneven. Memphis loses the ability to gather Egypt under one unquestioned royal centre, but local centres do not vanish. In some places, They may even become more important. Provincial governors, temple communities, estate managers, and local families continue to operate, sometimes under conditions of stress, sometimes with new opportunities. What looks like collapse from the point of view of the palace may look like transformation from the point of view of the provinces. The term First Intermediate Period carries its own problem. It was created by modern historians to describe the era between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, a time when Egypt was not unified under one stable royal house in the old way. The phrase is practical, but it can sound like an empty space between two real ages, as if the period exists only because it comes after one greatness and before another. In reality, it is a world of its own. It has politics, art, literature, local identity, conflict, adaptation, and memory. It is not merely an interruption. It is part of the process by which Egypt changes. Later, Egyptian tradition often presents periods without strong centralized kingship as times of chaos, hunger, and social reversal. That view is not meaningless, but it is ideological. Egyptian political thought values unity. The two lands are supposed to be joined. A legitimate king is supposed to uphold Maat, maintain offerings, defeat disorder, and bind the country into one cosmic and administrative whole. From that perspective, political fragmentation is not a neutral arrangement. It is a wound in the order of the world. Later rulers who reunify Egypt have every reason to remember division as darkness, because their own legitimacy shines brighter against it. But archaeology complicates the picture. The record does not show a country uniformly destroyed everywhere at once. Some regions suffer, some adapt, some grow more distinctive. Local tombs and inscriptions reveal elites who still possess resources and ambition. Artistic styles shift, sometimes becoming more provincial, less bound to the polished court standards of the Old Kingdom. But that does not mean they are simply crude or failed. They may express different workshops, different patrons, different priorities, and different centers of meaning. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a landscape of uneven change rather than a single nationwide ruin. This is why the collapse of the Old Kingdom is better imagined as a loss of integration. The pieces remain, but the system that once made them operate together under royal command weakens. The king's authority no longer coordinates the whole land with the same force. The flow of resources toward royal pyramid complexes diminishes. Provincial leaders act with greater independence. Local cults and local cemeteries become more prominent. The old hierarchy does not simply vanish, but it becomes less able to control the balance between center and region. The country is still alive, but its political body has become fragmented. A useful image is not a shattered vase, but a rope whose fibers have loosened. The rope still exists. Many strands remain strong, but the binding tension that made them act as one has slackened. The Old Kingdom's rope was made from many fibers: Nile agriculture, royal ideology, scribal administration, elite service, mortuary cults, provincial governance, long-distance expeditions, temple economies, and the symbolic power of the king. When enough of those fibers shift under pressure, the rope no longer holds the same shape. The end is not instantaneous, it is structural. One lesser-known but important point is that collapse often looks different depending on the scale of observation. At the scale of royal history, the end of the Old Kingdom is dramatic dynasties blur, kings become obscure, pyramids lose grandeur, and central authority falters. At the scale of a village, the experience may be slower and more practical. A tax collector comes less predictably. A local official becomes more powerful. A temple storehouse matters more. burial customs shift, and the name of a distant king may mean less in daily survival. At the scale of a provincial elite family, the same moment may even be a rise greater local autonomy, richer tomb display, stronger hereditary office, and more room to define status outside the immediate shadow of Memphis. That does not make the period peaceful or easy. Fragmentation can bring conflict, insecurity, and competition over resources. Later inscriptions and literary traditions remember hunger and disorder for a reason, even if they shape those memories through convention. Low floods, if they affected the period significantly, would have increased pressure on communities already navigating political uncertainty. Rival centers of power could make redistribution less reliable. Roads and river routes could become more politically complicated. The weakening of one central authority does not automatically create freedom. It can create vulnerability. Still, the story is not simply one of darkness spreading over Egypt. It is a story of old structures failing and new arrangements emerging before anyone fully knows what they will become. The problem of language also affects how the pyramids are understood. If the old kingdom collapsed, then the pyramids can look like monuments to arrogance, as if Egypt exhausted itself in stone. If the old kingdom transformed, then the pyramids become monuments to a system that was brilliant, adaptive, and eventually unable to sustain its own scale under changing conditions. The second view is less dramatic, but more truthful. The Pyramid Age did not end because Egyptians suddenly forgot how to organize, believe, or build. It ended because the particular concentration of power that made the greatest pyramid complexes possible no longer existed in the same form. This concentration had required a rare alignment: strong kingship, dependable surplus, controllable officials, royal ideology, administrative discipline, and environmental cooperation had to reinforce one another. For centuries, they did. When that alignment weakened, Egypt did not cease to be Egypt. It became a more divided Egypt, a more regional Egypt, an Egypt in which the old royal centre no longer monopolized the future. The memory of unity remained powerful, perhaps even more powerful because it had been lost. Later rulers would look back on the Old Kingdom not merely as a past age, but as a standard of what kingship could claim to be. So the end of the Pyramid Age sits between collapse and continuity. It is a fall of central power, but not a disappearance of culture. It is a crisis of kingship, but not the end of Egyptian imagination. It is a break in royal capacity, but also a redistribution of authority into the provinces. The Great Pyramids still stand, but their silence changes. They no longer say only that Egypt was mighty. They also say that might depends on conditions no monument can permanently command. The Old Kingdom ends not with the erasure of a people, but with the failure of an arrangement. And in ancient history, the failure of an arrangement can be as consequential as the fall of a city. Long after the Great Pyramids have lost their gleaming casing stones, long after the kings of the Old Kingdom have become ancestral names, Egypt remembers hunger, it remembers disorder, it remembers a world turned upside down, where the proper flow of offerings fails, where the poor and the powerful exchange places in literary imagination, where the river does not behave as it should, and where the order promised by kingship seems to tremble. These memories are among the most haunting traces of the period after the Pyramid Age, but they are also among the most difficult to use. They sound vivid, almost eyewitness-like at times, yet they often survive in later compositions, copied, shaped, and moralized by scribes who are not simply recording events. They are thinking with the past. They are turning crisis into literature. This is where the end of the Old Kingdom becomes especially elusive. Stone can be measured, tombs can be mapped, pottery can be dated, sediments can be analysed, but memory is more slippery. Later Egyptian texts that evoke famine and chaos may preserve echoes of real trauma, but they also belong to a tradition in which disorder has a symbolic role. Egyptian thought often defines good rule by imagining its opposite. A proper king brings abundance, justice, full temples, stable ranks, fertile fields, and peace between the two lands. A failed age is imagined through empty granaries, dry land, social confusion, neglected rituals, and fear. These images may reflect lived experience, but they are also part of the grammar of political and moral reflection. The famous laments and pessimistic texts associated with Egypt's later literary tradition do not function like modern news reports. They are not simple diaries from the final days of the Old Kingdom. They speak in heightened language, often using reversal as a way to express the collapse of Maat. The servant becomes insolent, the noble loses security, the tomb is neglected, the river is strange, the land is poor, and old certainties no longer hold. This does not make them useless. On the contrary, their power lies in showing what Egyptians feared most deeply. They reveal the emotional architecture of crisis. To an Egyptian mind, collapse is not merely political fragmentation. It is the breakdown of a world in which every rank, ritual, harvest, and obligation is supposed to hold its proper place. Famine traditions are especially important because they connect environmental stress to moral and political imagination. A low Nile flood can be described as a physical event, but in Egyptian memory, hunger becomes more than bad weather. It becomes a sign that the bond between kingship and order has weakened. If fields fail, offerings fail. If offerings fail, temples weaken. If temples weaken, the gods are not properly served. If the gods are not served, cosmic balance itself appears endangered. The chain may not have been understood so mechanically in every village or every period, but the broad connection between abundance, ritual, and legitimate rule is central to Egyptian political culture. Food is never only food. It is proof that the world is still working. At the same time, the evidence remains incomplete. Later literary memories cannot be placed directly over the archaeological record like a transparent map. A text composed or copied centuries later may look back on an era of division and reshape it for new purposes. Middle Kingdom rulers, for example, had strong reasons to present reunification as salvation after disorder. The darker the remembered chaos, the brighter the restored king. This does not mean the chaos was invented. It means memory is political. A society recovering unity may describe the past in ways that explain why unity matters. The first intermediate period becomes a warning, a contrast, a lesson in what happens when central kingship fails. There is a lesser-known caution here that matters for the entire story of the Pyramid Age. Ancient Egyptian texts often use formulaic language. Claims of feeding the hungry, protecting the weak, sustaining a town, or preventing distress can appear in elite autobiographies as ideal statements of virtue. A governor who says he fed his district may have truly managed food in a hard time. He may also be presenting himself through an established moral vocabulary expected of a good official. The line between historical report and ideal self-fashioning is not always clear. Scholars still debate how much direct evidence of famine can be extracted from such statements. But even if the language is partly conventional, it points toward a world where provision had become a central claim of authority. That shift is revealing. In the strongest pyramid-building age, royal ideology displays abundance through scale, order, and proximity to the king. In the later provincial world, local elites increasingly emphasize their ability to sustain communities. They present themselves as providers in a time when provision seems uncertain. This is not merely kindness carved into stone, it is politics. To feed is to rule. To manage grain is to command loyalty. To claim that no one in a district lacked support is to occupy, at least locally, a role once associated with the broader promise of kingship. The memory of famine therefore strengthens the story of provincial power. When the centre weakens, the person who controls food nearby becomes the face of order. The ancient voices also reveal how deeply Egyptians feared the neglect of the dead. In a society where offerings, names, tombs, and rituals sustain the afterlife, political and economic breakdown threatens not only the living, it threatens memory itself. A tomb without offerings is a wounded eternity. A mortuary cult without supplies is an institution failing in its sacred purpose. The end of the Pyramid Age is therefore not only a crisis of administration, it is a crisis of continuity between generations. The dead kings require bread and beer, elite tomb owners require remembrance, families require ritual stability. When resources tighten and authority fragments, the line between living duty and ancestral care becomes harder to maintain. This may be one reason later memories of disorder feel so intense. They're not only about hunger in the stomach, they're about hunger in the temples, hunger at the offering table, hunger in the moral order of the world. The Egyptian imagination links material scarcity to cosmic fragility. A low flood does not remain hydrology. It becomes a sign that the proper relationship between gods, king, land, and people is strained. This is why the end of the Old Kingdom echoes so strongly through later tradition. It represents a frightening possibility that even a civilization built around order can experience a time when order no longer seems to answer. Yet the ancient voices do not speak with one simple message. Some preserve despair, others preserve pride. Provincial officials present themselves as capable, generous, effective, and rooted in their communities. Royal ideology later reclaims the language of unity. Scribes reflect on disorder not only to mourn it, but to understand how it might be overcome. The first intermediate period becomes a memory of danger, but also a reservoir of lessons. It shows that Egypt can fragment and still survive. It can suffer a weakening of kingship and still retain enough cultural continuity to rebuild. The story is dark, but not terminal. This makes famine memory both evidence and warning. It tells us that Egyptians remembered a rupture serious enough to shape literature and political thought. It suggests that scarcity, whether caused by low floods, administrative breakdown, regional conflict, or all of these together, became central to how the age was imagined. But it also warns us not to mistake literary darkness for a simple photograph of reality. The past is speaking through ritual language, elite boasting, moral reflection, and later political needs. It must be heard, but not obeyed blindly. So the voices from after the Pyramid Age deepen the mystery rather than closing it. They do not hand over a single cause. They reveal a civilization trying to explain how the world of divine kings, full granaries, and eternal monuments could become a world of uncertainty. They show hunger remembered not only as a physical hardship, but as a sign that the old bonds had loosened between Nile and field, palace and province, living and dead, king and mat, in those memories. The end of the Old Kingdom becomes more than an administrative failure. It becomes a wound in Egypt's idea of itself. Out of the weakening Old Kingdom emerges a country that is still recognizably Egypt, but no longer held together in the old way. The pyramids remain on the western horizon, but they no longer command the future. Memphis is still important, still heavy with memory, still tied to royal tradition. Yet its power no longer reaches across the Nile Valley with the same force. In the spaces where central authority thins, regional centres begin to harden into political worlds of their own. The first intermediate period is often described as an age of disorder, and there is truth in that description, but disorder is not the same as emptiness. What appears is not a ruined silence. It is a crowded, competitive landscape of local rulers, rival courts, provincial identities, inherited offices, ambitious families, and communities trying to preserve order on a smaller scale. The exact sequence of events remains difficult to reconstruct. The evidence is uneven, the king lists are complicated, and later memory sometimes arranges the past into cleaner patterns than the past itself probably possessed. After the 6th dynasty, there are short reigns, obscure rulers, and dynasties whose authority may have been limited in practice, even when their names are preserved in tradition. The old royal line gives way to a more fractured political reality. In the north, Heracleopolis eventually becomes one major centre of kingship. In the south, Thebes rises from a regional power into a rival force. Between and around them, local governors and elite families manage their own territories, sometimes acknowledging larger rulers, sometimes acting with striking independence. Egypt is no longer a single pyramid-shaped hierarchy with the king at the uncontested summit. It becomes more like a chain of strongholds along the river, each tied to local land, local gods, local memory and local survival. This is the world that follows when the old arrangement fails. Not every official suddenly rejects kingship. On the contrary, kingship remains the essential language of legitimacy. Even rival rulers claim royal titles, invoke divine order, and present themselves as restorers rather than destroyers. No one needs to invent a new political imagination from nothing. The power of the old ideal is too deep. Egypt still believes that the two lands should be united, that order should be upheld, that temples should receive offerings, that the dead should be remembered, and that legitimate authority should stand between the people and chaos. The problem is that more than one centre now claims the ability to do this. Unity remains the dream, but division has become the fact. In many regions, provincial rulers become the practical face of government. Their tombs and inscriptions offer glimpses of a society in which local leadership matters intensely. They claim to have maintained food supplies, protected their districts, controlled their officials, supported temples, and acted as guardians of order in difficult times. These claims are shaped by elite self-presentation and cannot be read as simple autobiography in every detail. Still, they show what kind of authority was valued. The good ruler is not merely the one closest to Memphis. He is the one who can make life continue nearby. He can organize fields, store grain, manage labor, support ritual, and defend local identity. In a divided Egypt, legitimacy becomes more immediate. A striking example comes from the south, where provincial inscriptions speak with a voice that is very different from the polished universality of earlier royal monuments. The local ruler is proud, forceful, rooted in his territory. He speaks not as a small reflection of the king, but as someone whose own actions shape the fate of towns and districts. Scholars still debate how much these texts reflect actual crisis and how much they reflect conventional boasting, yet their tone is unmistakable. The centre is no longer the only place where history is being claimed. The provinces are writing themselves into Egypt's story. The art of the period also reveals a changed world. Compared with the controlled elegance of Old Kingdom court style, some first intermediate period works appear more regional, more varied, sometimes less technically uniform, but often more emotionally direct. It is tempting to call this decline, and earlier scholarship sometimes did, but that judgment can be too narrow. When the court no longer dominates artistic production as completely, local workshops develop their own habits. Proportions change, carving styles vary. Decoration may look less standardized because the patrons, artists, materials, and expectations are different. This is not simply a failure to imitate Memphis. It is evidence of a country whose cultural life has become more decentralized. The old canon survives, but it is no longer enforced from one overwhelming center. A lesser-known detail of this period is that the broadening of funerary hopes begins to become more visible. Royal afterlife language and protective religious ideas do not remain locked forever inside royal pyramids. Over time, more non-royal elites seek access to texts, rituals, and images that promise transformation after death. This process is complex and develops across generations. But the first intermediate period and the following Middle Kingdom show a world in which eternity is no longer imagined only through the king's exclusive assent. The dead of the elite provinces want their own protection, their own spells, their own routes into the afterlife. Even in death, power has become less centralized. At the same time, political fragmentation brings real risk. Rival centers compete for territory, legitimacy, and control of the river corridor. Trade routes and resource flows may become more uncertain. Local conflicts can disrupt the smooth movement of goods. A province that once served as part of a larger administrative chain may now have to negotiate, defend, or align itself differently. The Nile still connects Egypt physically, but politically the river becomes a line of competition as well as connection. Whoever controls key stretches of it controls movement, communication, grain, and symbolic access to the whole country. Heracleopolis and Thebes eventually give this divided age its larger shape. Heracleopolis, located in Middle Egypt, claims kingship in the north and carries forward some memory of Old Kingdom political tradition. Thebes, once far less central to national power, grows into the southern rival whose rulers will ultimately reunify Egypt. The rise of Thebes is one of the great transformations of Egyptian history. A city that had not built the colossal pyramids of the Old Kingdom becomes the base from which a new vision of kingship emerges. This alone shows how deeply the old map of power has changed. The future no longer belongs automatically to the old Memphite world. Yet even as rival powers rise, the cultural continuity of Egypt remains remarkable. People still bury their dead with care. They still decorate tombs with scenes of provision and status. They still use hieroglyphs, titles, ritual formulas, and offerings to make memory durable. They still understand the world through the relationship between order and chaos. The first intermediate period is not a break in Egyptian civilization. It is a break in centralized royal control. That distinction gives the age its tension. Everything is familiar, and yet the structure holding it together has changed. The result is an Egypt of competing orders. Each local ruler claims to preserve stability. Each regional center imagines itself as necessary. Each dynasty presents its authority through older forms, even when the political reality is new. This is why the period can feel both chaotic and creative. The weakening of the Old Kingdom opens space for insecurity, but also for regional expression. It exposes the fragility of central power, but also the resilience of local institutions. It shows that Egypt can survive without the Pyramid Age, though not without remembering it. By the time the first intermediate period fully emerges, the question is no longer simply why the Old Kingdom fell, it is what kind of Egypt can exist after the fall. The answer is not immediate. It is worked out through rival courts, local tombs, shifting alliances, practical survival, and the long desire to reunite the two lands. The pyramids still stand behind the story, immense and silent, but the living country has moved beyond them. The age of one overwhelming royal centre has given way to an age in which power must be argued, defended, and rebuilt along the river, one region at a time. By the time Egypt enters the divided world after the Old Kingdom, the mystery of the Pyramid Age can no longer be answered by pointing to one broken piece. The end is not hidden in a single dry riverbed, a single weak king, a single ambitious governor, a single empty granary, or a single abandoned temple. It lies in the way these pressures overlap. Each explanation is partly convincing because each touches something real. Climate matters because the Nile sustains the fields. Politics matters because the king's authority holds the country together. Administration matters because power must be counted, stored, transported, and enforced. Economy matters because monuments and cults require resources. Succession matters because kingship depends on continuity. Ideology matters because Egyptians understand order not as a theory, but as the condition under which the world can live. The fall of the Old Kingdom is not a locked door with one key. It is a house whose beams begin to strain in several places at once. The climate explanation has an obvious power because Egypt depends so directly on the river. If Nile floods weakened for a series of years, the effects could travel through the kingdom with frightening speed. Fields would produce less, grain stores would shrink, taxes would be harder to collect, labour crews would be harder to feed, temples and mortuary cults would compete more sharply for provisions, provincial officials would gain importance as managers of local survival. The king's claim to uphold order would face a material test. It is difficult to imagine a more dangerous environmental pressure on Old Kingdom Egypt than repeated poor inundations. A state built on surplus becomes vulnerable when surplus narrows. Yet climate alone is not enough. There had been difficult floods before, and Egypt would face difficult conditions again in later centuries without disappearing as a civilization. A poor Nile flood becomes historically decisive only through the society it strikes. If royal administration is strong, if storage is effective, if local officials remain loyal, if succession is stable, and if legitimacy remains convincing, environmental stress can be absorbed. It may hurt, but it does not necessarily break the system. This is why scholars still debate the weight of the climatic evidence. Lower floods may have been a trigger, an accelerant, or a background pressure, but no single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. The river may expose weakness, but it does not create every weakness by itself. The political explanation looks toward the provinces. Over time, local officials become stronger, more visible, and more deeply rooted in their districts. Their tombs grow in importance, their titles accumulate, their families become associated with office, their relationship with the king remains important, but their practical authority depends increasingly on regional land, labour, temples, and storage. This process may have begun as a solution to the problem of governing a long country. The crown needs capable local administrators. It needs men who know irrigation patterns, tax possibilities, workforce availability, desert routes, and local families. But the same local expertise that strengthens the state can eventually limit it. A governor who controls the local machinery of survival is not easy to replace from Memphis. Here again, however, provincial power alone is not a full answer. Strong local administration does not automatically destroy central kingship. It may even make it stronger for a time. The Old Kingdom's reach depends on people who can act effectively far from the court. The problem emerges when provincial strength is combined with other pressures: weak floods, uncertain succession, reduced royal resources, and a mortuary economy crowded with obligations. Under those conditions, local officials may no longer function simply as extensions of the palace. They become centres of power in their own right. The provinces do not need to overthrow the king dramatically. They only need to become indispensable enough that royal command becomes negotiable. The economic explanation turns toward the immense cost of maintaining the royal system. The pyramids themselves are not merely construction projects, they create institutions. Every royal mortuary complex requires priests, offerings, estates, storage, transport, maintenance, and administrative oversight. Earlier kings do not vanish after death. Their cults continue to claim resources. Their names continue to require service. Their temples remain part of the sacred and economic landscape. Over generations, these obligations accumulate. The living king must build his own monument while inheriting the ritual demands of dead kings. The state becomes crowded with eternity. This idea is compelling, but it also needs caution. It would be too simple to say that pyramids bankrupted Egypt. The monuments were not foolish extravagances standing outside the state. They were part of how the state functioned. They organized labor, redistributed goods, trained administration, expressed ideology, and reinforced royal authority. In their strongest phase, pyramid projects may have strengthened the kingdom rather than weakened it. But over time, the balance could shift. If the flow of surplus declines or the centre's control weakens, institutions that once displayed abundance may become heavier to sustain. The problem is not that religion costs money. The problem is that a sacred economy designed for perpetual support becomes vulnerable when the material base beneath it contracts. The administrative explanation focuses on complexity. The Old Kingdom's power depends on officials, scribes, offices, records, inspections, stores, and chains of command. This bureaucracy is one of Egypt's great achievements. Without it, there are no great pyramids, no coordinated expeditions, no large-scale redistribution, no lasting mortuary institutions. But bureaucracy can also create its own momentum. Offices gain prestige, titles multiply. Families learn to use administrative service as a path to enduring status. The king needs skilled officials, and skilled officials know their own value. A system created to concentrate power can, over generations, help distribute power among those who manage it. Still, bureaucracy does not collapse by existing. Every state requires structure. The question is whether the Old Kingdom's administrative structure remained flexible enough under stress. Could it adjust tax expectations after poor floods? Could it prevent local offices from becoming hereditary power bases? Could it keep royal estates, provincial obligations, temple privileges, and labour demands in balance? Could it renew itself after long reigns and short successions? The evidence remains incomplete, but the later pattern suggests increasing difficulty. The system could still function, but perhaps it could no longer easily correct itself. Succession adds another layer. The long reign traditionally associated with Pepi II may have provided stability for decades, yet it may also have delayed renewal and allowed entrenched interests to grow. After his reign, the royal sequence becomes uncertain and unstable. Short reigns and obscure rulers are dangerous in a system where kingship is the central bond between politics and cosmic order. Each succession requires recognition, ritual, administrative continuity, and elite cooperation. If the transition is weak, governors and powerful families may gain even more room to act independently. A pyramid can be planned only when a king has enough time, resources, and authority to command it. A fragile throne cannot easily produce monumental certainty. Ideology, finally, shapes how all these pressures are understood. The king is supposed to embody Maat, the order that binds the world. But ideology is not a shield against reality. It works best when the world seems to confirm it. Good floods, successful harvests, visible monuments, full temples, obedient officials, and stable succession all make divine kingship feel true in practice. When those signs weaken, the ideology may remain, but its performance becomes strained. The Egyptians do not stop believing in kingship. In fact, the desire to restore kingship becomes one of the driving forces of later reunification. But the Old Kingdom form of kingship, centered on overwhelming pyramid-building power at Memphis, loses its ability to hold the whole country together. This is the most important point. The explanations do not compete as if only one can be right. They interact. A weak Nile flood is more dangerous when granaries are already stretched by obligations. Provincial officials become more powerful when they control scarce local resources. Succession becomes more fragile when elite families are already entrenched. Mortuary cults become more burdensome when surplus declines. Ideology becomes more vulnerable when administration fails to deliver visible order. Each pressure makes the others sharper. The end of the Pyramid Age is a cascade, not a single blow. A lesser-known way to think about this is through the difference between shock and fragility. A shock is an event or pressure, low floods, political conflict, a disputed succession, a failed harvest. Fragility is the condition that determines what the shock does. Two societies can face similar environmental stress and experience very different outcomes depending on storage, leadership, social trust, local autonomy, and institutional flexibility. The Old Kingdom's tragedy is not that it faced stress. All ancient states face stress. Its tragedy is that the structures that once made it extraordinary may have become less able to absorb stress without changing form. The Great Pyramids are therefore both evidence of strength and clues to vulnerability. They show what Egypt could do when concentration worked. They also show how much depended on concentration continuing to work. The labour, grain, transport, stone, skill, ritual, and obedience required by pyramid culture were not incidental. They were the living bloodstream of the Old Kingdom. When that bloodstream no longer flowed toward the royal centre with the same force, the Pyramid Age could not simply continue on memory alone. So the answer to the mystery is not one cause, but a convergence. The Nile may have weakened, the provinces strengthened, the bureaucracy thickened, the mortuary economy accumulated obligations, the royal succession faltered. The ideology of kingship remained powerful, but its old institutional body grew strained. Together, these forces did what none of them alone may have been able to do. They ended the age when Egypt could turn divine kingship into mountains of stone. They did not end Egypt. They ended a particular way of making Egypt one. The broken kingdom does not rebuild itself by forgetting the Pyramid Age. It rebuilds itself by remembering it, arguing with it, and reshaping it into something that can survive under different conditions. After the Old Kingdom, Egypt still carries the image of the divine king as the center of order, but the country has learned a hard lesson. A king who claims the two lands must do more than inherit a title. He must prove that unity can be made real again across provinces that have grown strong, families that have learned local power, temples that possess their own interests, and communities that have discovered how much survival depends on nearby authority. The future of Egypt will not be a simple return to the age of Khufu. It will be a reconstruction, built from memory and necessity. The reunification that eventually leads into the Middle Kingdom comes from the south, from Thebes, a place that had not been the great royal centre of the Pyramid Age. This is one of the most important turns in Egyptian history. The world after the Old Kingdom does not simply restore Memphis to its old unquestioned position. Instead, a regional power rises, fights, negotiates, claims legitimacy, and gradually imposes unity. The Theban rulers, especially the line that culminates in Mentuhotep II, present themselves not as local chiefs who have replaced kingship with something new, but as kings who restore what has been damaged. That distinction matters. Egyptian political imagination still longs for unity. The successful ruler is not the man who celebrates fragmentation, but the one who can end it. The process is not gentle or purely ceremonial. Reunification requires military struggle, political calculation, control of river routes, alliance building, and the ability to persuade elites that a new centre deserves obedience. The evidence remains incomplete, and many details of the conflict between Thebes and Heracleopolis remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty. But the broad movement is clear enough. The divided country does not remain divided forever. The south grows stronger. The northern rival weakens or is overcome. A new royal house claims the whole land, and Egypt enters the Middle Kingdom with a renewed but altered vision of kingship. This new vision does not abandon the old sacred language. The king remains central to Mut. He remains the one who upholds order, serves the gods, protects the land, and binds Upper and Lower Egypt together. But the memory of fragmentation changes the tone of kingship. Middle Kingdom rulers are often more visibly concerned with justice, administration, frontier defense, irrigation, provincial management, and the moral responsibilities of rule. The king is still divine, but he's also expected to be effective in a more practical and self-conscious way. The trauma of disunity gives later kings a sharper political vocabulary. They do not merely inherit order, they must restore it, guard it, and explain it. A lesser-known but revealing change lies in the relationship between royal power and local elites. The Middle Kingdom does not simply erase the provinces. Provincial governors remain important, and some nomarchs in the early Middle Kingdom can still be extremely powerful. Their tombs, especially in places such as Beni Hassan, show confidence, wealth, military display, hunting scenes, and strong local identity. The restored kingdom therefore begins with compromise as well as command. The crown must work with provincial power before it can fully discipline it. Over time, Middle Kingdom rulers reduce the independence of some local dynasties and reassert tighter central control. But this takes policy, patience, and strategy. The lesson of the Old Kingdom is not that local power can be ignored. It is that local power must be managed before it becomes a rival structure. The royal mortuary landscape also changes. The Middle Kingdom kings build pyramids again, especially around areas such as Lisht and later Dashur and other sites. But these are not the same as the colossal pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty. They are often built with different methods, including mud brick cores and stone casing, and many are now heavily ruined. Their scale and construction speak to a different age. The pyramid remains a royal symbol, still powerful, still connected to the deep memory of ancient kingship, but it no longer dominates the state in quite the same way. The form survives, while the meaning adjusts. Egypt remembers the Pyramid Age, but it does not simply repeat it. This is one of the most moving aspects of Egyptian continuity. The past is never discarded, it is reused, reinterpreted, and folded into new political needs. Later kings look back to the Old Kingdom as an age of origins and authority. The pyramids become ancestral monuments, proof that Egyptian kingship once reached almost unimaginable heights. But they are also warnings. They show what centralized power can accomplish and what it can lose. A Middle Kingdom ruler who invokes ancient models does so in a world that knows unity can fail. The old stones are no longer only monuments of triumph, they are monuments of memory. The experience of breakdown also affects literature and moral thought. Middle Kingdom texts often show a deep concern with order, speech, loyalty, social responsibility, and the dangers of chaos. Some works imagine troubled times, unreliable officials, suffering communities, or the need for a wise king to restore balance. These texts are literary and cannot be treated as direct windows into one historical moment, but they reveal a society thinking intensely about political stability. The Egyptian mind returns again and again to the problem of what happens when Mat is not secured. The end of the Pyramid Age becomes part of that meditation, whether directly remembered or absorbed into a broader cultural fear of disorder. The state that emerges after reunification is therefore more cautious in some ways, more experienced, and perhaps more aware of fragility. It invests in administration, it watches the provinces, it develops frontier zones and fortifications, especially toward Nubia in later phases. It strengthens royal ideology, while also emphasizing the king's responsibility to act. It supports temples and local cults, while working to ensure that the crown remains the final source of legitimate authority. The Middle Kingdom is not simply the Old Kingdom revived. It is Egypt after a lesson in failure. No reconstruction is perfect. Provincial ambition does not vanish forever. Nile variability does not cease. Royal succession can still become dangerous. Later Egyptian history will know other crises, other divisions, other foreign pressures, other moments when unity breaks. But the recovery after the Old Kingdom shows that collapse is not always an ending. Sometimes it is the painful process by which a civilization discovers which parts of itself can survive the failure of a political form. The Pyramid Age ends, but Egyptian kingship adapts. The old divine mountain gives way to a more complicated state, one that still dreams in ancient symbols but governs with the memory of fracture behind it. This is why the fall of the Old Kingdom should not be imagined only as decline. It is also the beginning of a long Egyptian habit of restoration. Later rulers will repeatedly present themselves as healers of disorder, renewers of temples, reuniters of lands, protectors of boundaries, and guardians of an order older than themselves. That language gains much of its force because Egypt has known what disunity feels like. The broken kingdom gives later kings a story to overcome. At the edge of the desert, the old pyramids continue to stand while new powers rise far to the south. Their presence reminds every later ruler that Egypt once concentrated its entire world into stone. But the age that follows learns that stone alone cannot hold a country together. A kingdom must be renewed in fields, offices, temples, roads, river ports, provincial alliances, and acts of justice that people can recognize. The Middle Kingdom grows from the ruins not by denying the Pyramid Age, but by carrying its memory into a different form of power. The broken kingdom is rebuilt, yet the cracks remain part of the design. The mystery left in stone is not whether the Old Kingdom ended. It did. The age of the greatest pyramid-building kings passed away, and the system that once made Giza possible never returned in the same form. The mystery is why a state so capable, so organized, so confident in its divine order, could reach such heights and then lose the particular balance that made those heights possible. The pyramids invite awe because they seem to defeat time, but they also invite misunderstanding because they conceal the fragility beneath them. Stone survives better than grain. Royal names survive better than local negotiations. Tombs survive better than failed harvests. Monuments survive better than the trust that once moved people, food, and labour toward a king. What remains is massive. What vanished was delicate. The end of the Pyramid Age is therefore not a single dramatic answer waiting beneath the sand. It is a convergence of forces whose exact proportions scholars still debate. Climate stress may have reduced Nile floods and narrowed the agricultural surplus that fed the state. Provincial officials may have grown too powerful for the old central structure to control easily. Mortuary cults may have accumulated obligations that were meaningful in sacred terms, but heavy in economic ones. Bureaucracy may have become layered, prestigious, and increasingly tied to elite families. Long reigns and uncertain successions may have weakened the ability of the throne to renew itself. Royal ideology may have remained majestic, but majesty alone could not fill granaries, discipline governors, or make the river rise. Yet none of these causes works properly in isolation. The Nile does not explain everything, because societies can survive drought when institutions are resilient. Provincial ambition does not explain everything, because local government had long been necessary to Egyptian power. Pyramid cults do not explain everything, because they were part of the system's strength before they became part of its burden. Succession does not explain everything, because a weak heir matters most when the structure around the throne is already strained. The real mystery is the interaction. Each pressure makes the others more dangerous. A low flood matters more when local officials control the nearest stores. A strong governor matters more when the court has less surplus. A mortuary obligation weighs more heavily when the living king must compete with the dead. An ideology of perfect order becomes more vulnerable when ordinary people can see disorder in fields, taxes, tombs, and food. This is why the pyramids remain such powerful evidence. They are not only symbols of power, they are diagrams of dependence. To build one requires a river that produces enough grain, officials who can count and command, workers who can be fed, specialists who can be trained, quarries that can be opened, boats that can transport, priests who can sanctify, and a society willing to accept that the king's eternity is worth collective effort. A pyramid is not merely stone stacked high. It is a whole country briefly made visible. When the old kingdom can no longer build in that way, the loss is not architectural alone. It means the country can no longer be gathered into one royal act with the same force. And still, the story should not end in ruin. Egypt does not disappear into the desert. The fall of the old kingdom is not the extinction of a people or the erasure of a culture. It is the failure of a particular political arrangement, one centered on the overwhelming concentration of resources around divine kingship and monumental eternity. After that failure, Egypt changes. It fragments, competes, remembers, adapts, and eventually reunifies. The provinces that once seemed like signs of weakness become part of the story of survival. The local officials who complicate royal power also preserve order in smaller worlds. The same country that loses the Pyramid Age later creates the Middle Kingdom, with a different tone, a different political memory, and a kingship sharpened by the knowledge that unity can break. The surviving stones therefore hold a double message. They proclaim triumph, but they also preserve warning. The Great Pyramid does not look fragile, it looks inevitable. But nothing that made it possible was inevitable. The river had to rise, the fields had to yield, the state had to calculate, the officials had to obey, the workers had to be supplied, the king had to be believed, the living had to feed the dead, the provinces had to accept the centre, year after year, season after season. The arrangement had to be renewed. The monument could stand still, but the society beneath it had to keep moving. A lesser-known truth about ancient collapse is that it often becomes visible only after people have already adapted to it. No one wakes one morning and sees an inscription across the sky announcing the end of an age. A smaller pyramid is built. A local tomb grows grander. A flood disappoints. A governor claims he fed his people. A royal name becomes obscure. A temple privilege is protected by decree. A work crew is harder to provision. A king dies after too long a reign. Another rules too briefly to restore confidence. Each event may seem manageable alone. Together, they become history. The end of Egypt's Pyramid Age is so haunting because it shows that civilization does not require total destruction to be transformed beyond recognition. Sometimes the fields are still green in places, the temples still active, the scribe still writing, the dead still buried with care, and yet the old world is gone. The centre no longer holds. The meaning of power moves. The future begins elsewhere. The pyramids remain, but they become memories of a kind of kingship that Egypt can admire. Invoke and imitate, but never fully recover. So what caused the end of the Pyramid Age? The most careful answer is also the most human one. It ended because a brilliant system became vulnerable to the very forces it depended on. It depended on the Nile, and the Nile could fail. It depended on officials, and officials could become local powers. It depended on surplus, and surplus could shrink. It depended on eternal cults, and eternity had costs. It depended on kingship, and kingship needed more than sacred language to remain effective. It depended on the belief that order could be made permanent. But order is not stone. It is practice. It is maintenance. It is a relationship between land, people, power, and time. The desert keeps the stones because stones are good at surviving. It does not keep the smell of bread from workers' ovens, the sound of scribes reading accounts, the anxiety before a poor flood, the negotiations inside provincial estates, the quiet ambitions of local families, or the moment when someone realized the old certainty was no longer certain. Those things have to be reconstructed from fragments. That is why the mystery remains alive. The pyramids seem to answer with silence. But their silence is not empty. It is full of all the things that had to happen for them to exist, and all the things that eventually changed so they could not be built that way again. The last light settles across the pyramid fields, and the stones lose their sharpness. Their edges soften into shadow. The desert becomes quiet in the way only old places can be quiet, not empty, but full of what has passed beyond reach. The kings who built these monuments wanted their names to endure forever, and in a strange way, they succeeded. Their forms still rise against the sky. Their chambers still draw the living inward. Their causeways still point toward a vanished river edge. Their temples still hold traces of offerings once meant to continue without end. But the deeper story is not only about kings. It is about the world that carried them. It is about farmers watching the flood, scribes counting grain, boatmen moving stone, priests maintaining names, officials balancing loyalty and ambition, and communities living within a system too vast for any one person to see completely. It is about a civilization that turned death into architecture and order into landscape, then discovered that even the strongest order must be renewed by living hands. The Pyramid Age ended, but Egypt continued. That is the quiet truth at the center of the ruins. Human worlds do not always vanish in fire. Sometimes they fade into another form. A capital weakens, a province rises, a ritual changes, a memory becomes a lesson, a monument remains after its purpose has gone silent. The people who come afterward walk among the traces and try to understand what kind of power could have built so greatly, and what kind of fragility could have brought that power to an end. Across thousands of years, the pyramids still stand between permanence and loss. They remind us that human beings can organize themselves around astonishing dreams, and that even astonishing dreams depend on weather, food, trust, leadership, and time. They remind us that every civilization is both stronger and more fragile than it appears from a distance, and as the desert cools, as the last gold leaves the limestone, the old monuments seem less like answers than witnesses silent, immense, patient, watching the river valley where a kingdom once believed eternity could be built from stone.